Like the video, subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon for latest video updates.
Hi, welcome back to another episode of Examining Life. My name is Amanda, and today I am at the University of Athens with Professor Virvidakis. And thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you. Well, hello. My name is Virvidakis, and I have studied philosophy and history of philosophy in Athens, in Paris, France, and in the States at Princeton University, where I received my doctoral degree. And my areas of specialization are history of modern philosophy, contemporary ethics and meta-ethics, foundations of ethics, meta-philosophy, philosophy of religion, and philosophy of literature.
So one of the papers that you wrote was Virtue Ethics in Perspective. Can you give a brief summary of that paper?
Sure. Well, in recent years, there has been a kind of turn in moral philosophy, a kind of interest in a different tradition than the traditions which were dominant in modern philosophy. This new tradition takes us away from questions such as what are the principles or the rules that I must adopt in order to act correctly and properly in the moral sense, to questions about what kind of life should I lead, who should I be as a person, what kinds of character traits should I cultivate and develop. And this means that we turn to the notion of a virtue which existed, it hasn't disappeared in modern years, but it was not emphasized and it was not understood properly according to the people who proposed the revival of the virtue tradition. Among these people, I should mention the British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe. She wrote a very important seminal paper in the 50s, and then the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, who wrote this very important book, After Virtue, in the 70s. And then there are other people, Martha Nussbaum, the fragility of goodness. There is a whole new trend, which is an alternative to consequentialist theories and views such as utilitarianism and to Kantian deontological ethics. In other words, the virtue tradition is the big third player in the contemporary scene regarding normative ethics, basically, but also meta-ethical issues. Now, in this paper, Virtue Ethics in Perspective, first of all, I give a summary of the story of the revival, and then I discuss questions about the viability and prospects of growth, the perspectives of virtue ethics today. And to do that, I refer to some important philosophers, contemporary philosophers, such as Rosalind Hursthouse, a New Zealander who has written on virtue ethics, and I also mention other works. And I try to summarize the objections to virtue ethics. In other words, first of all, we are aware of the importance of the virtue turn in contemporary ethics, but there are also many criticisms, many papers criticizing and attacking or even attacking the whole virtue tradition, and there are still some important moral philosophers who don't seem to notice, or they neglect, they don't take into account virtue ethics. Peter Singer, the great utilitarian philosopher who is also very well known for his affirmative altruism or practical altruism, he has this movement, but he's also well known for the liberation of animals and so on. He's a vegetarian. He doesn't seem to worry about the virtue. And when I asked him once, he said, well, that's secondary, that's derivative. But there are people who criticize specific issues, specific aspects of virtue ethics, and these are the criticisms that I try to discuss and present in this paper and give my own view at the end. There are different kinds of virtue ethics, but the most important one is the one that goes back to Aristotle. So it was because there's Humean virtue ethics, there's even Nietzschean virtue ethics.
Yes,
But the kind of virtue ethics I'm mostly interested in is what comes at the beginning. In other words, Aristotle and then contemporary interpretations of Aristotle, neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So one thing mentioned in your paper is the difference between the ancient interpretations of virtue and the modern interpretation of virtue.
Difficulties in rendering ancient Greek terms, translating them into modern English or for modern Greek. We have a special problem because the words sound the same, they look the same, but they have acquired a new meaning. Right. So in English, for instance, that's why I think I mentioned this, there are problems in understanding virtue, and she, if I remember correctly, uses the word excellence, and she speaks excellencies of character, excellencies of the mind. Why? Just because she wants to show that virtue is not just any ordinary understanding of virtue, like a derivative notion, what is implied by a moral rule, but it's something which is there from the beginning. It's the excellence of a person, and this must be connected to another very difficult word, also very difficult to translate, which is eudaimonia, which is used sometimes translated as happiness. But the better way, I don't remember if she selects that, is flourishing. My teacher, John Cooper, I think was one of the first in the States, one of the first historians of philosopher who used the word flourishing for eudaimonia. And this shows that these difficulties, these choices in translation, which may sound strange to some people, say, why not say happiness? Why not say happiness? This shows that for us, they want to make clear that for us, happiness is a kind of subjective state of mind. I mean, you are happy, I'm happy inside, and this may be kind of subjective, while for Aristotle or the Greeks, it was an objective matter. It was an excellence that could be established in relation to the ergon, the function of human beings, like the function of a tree or of an organism. Remember that for Aristotle, biology was the model of study of life, let's say, living beings. So to have eudaimonia, to have this kind of happiness for a human being is like having the flourishing of an apple tree which blossoms and is blooming and so on. It's at its best. So when I try to explain this to the students, who actually in Greek I said it's even worse because we have the same word. I said, look, what Aristotle meant by that, eudaimonia, he meant the realization of your capacities, of your potential in the fullest and best possible way. That's why excellence comes into the picture. And then another difficulty, to give you an example, is that people usually tend to think that virtue is a means to an end. In other words, virtue is an instrument or a means to reach eudaimonia, to reach this kind of flourishing. But the correct way to interpret what Aristotle says is that it's not just a means. Eudaimonia is constituted by the virtues. Virtue is a constitutive element of this objective state of flourishing. So it's difficult for us to understand. Say, what is this? And then it's a very complicated model, as you know, if you've read the Nicomachean Ethics. It's a model involving intellectual virtues and moral virtues. Again, I think some people say, they don't use the word moral virtue, they say virtues of character. So you have virtues of character which are defined as a means between a defect and an excess, deficiency and excess, and so on. And then there is intellectuals, there are intellectual virtues, the most important of which is practical wisdom, which is phronesis. That's another difficult word to translate. They are very tightly, they are very closely related. They are organically related. In other words, you cannot have the one without the other. You have phronesis, when you have phronesis, you have this practical wisdom. This helps you understand where the mean lies. It's not just a rule that you apply automatically. It's something that you have to see. And Aristotle says the eye of the phronimos, he can see with his eye of experience where it is. But then this involves also, it's partly natural, it's partly innate, partly training, partly hexis, which means habituation, disposition of the soul built through training, habit. So it's a very complicated model. And then there is also even a different element, which is the highest possible intellectual virtue, which is wisdom, theoretical wisdom, but this is no use, this is not helpful for practical life. In practical life, where you build the virtues, you get the virtues of character, you have to use practical wisdom. How many virtuous people were there in ancient times, in ancient Athens? Very few. Very few, and that's one, here I'm getting into objections already. Some people argue against Aristotle that it's a very aristocratic model, not to mention the other things that we try to hush in his thought, which is what happens to women. Women cannot develop virtues because they don't have the nature that men have, so that's what cannot. The people that know Aristotelian virtue ethics, ethicists just discuss this, or they avoid it, or they just say, okay, let's put him in. When you interpret him, you just take into account that was his time, okay, and then
to modern day
slavery. Then there are people who are born to be slaves in Aristotelian thought, and so these are. But take them out, and then my question in this paper is taking out this very extreme for us, these views that he had because of his culture and so on, his framework, and let's look at what is happening with the rest. Does it work? Can we understand it? And here the objections begin. Further objections apart from the woman slavery question. And to put it in a nutshell, I argue that we lack the social framework, the sociological context, if you like, and the beliefs in the metaphysics of flourishing of the human soul. We are liberals today. We don't believe there is one kind of conception of the good, of eudaimonia, which in Aristotle is related to theoretical wisdom and so on. So what happens to the many people who just don't want that? We leave them out. The model, as the word excellence shows, is perfectionist and aristocratic, and it's difficult for us to implement. On the other hand, when you see the dead ends and the difficulties of other trends in moral philosophy, you say, well, let's go to virtue ethics, that will solve the problem. But do we understand? And what are the virtues? Another section of my period is what virtues? What virtues? If you go to China, is it the same? Okay.
No.
So I think there is this American philosopher who wrote something which I like very much in the 70s in a book called Ethics, William Frankena. That's a classical textbook where he says, traits of characters without principles are blind. So he said, principles without traits of character are impotent. So in other words, you need both. You need the virtues in order to sustain and enlighten the principles. You need the principles in order to guide the virtues. And of course, this is a gloss from another passage in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which is not a book of moral philosophy, but it's intuitions without concepts are blind. Concepts without intuitions are empty. So he adjusted this motto from Kant. There are two more objections that have been raised, one of which has been raised by moral psychologists who they set up situations in which they try to show that virtues don't exist. What do you mean by that? These stable traits of character are not really there. That's why this is called a situationist psychology. It depends on situations. But my problem is also relativism. That's the other objection which I tried to raise before. Virtues are kind of relative in the sense that they are situated, there are thick concepts in a culture. I mean, if you try to make them too thin, too abstract, you lose them. So the virtues of the ancient Greeks were one thing, the virtues of the modern Europeans are another thing, Chinese virtues are different. It's a different thing to be a Japanese samurai. What are the virtues of a Japanese samurai? The virtues of a Christian monk in the Middle Ages, the virtues of a Greek gentleman. I mean, Aristotle was writing basically for Greek aristocratic people. There's an aesthetic side to this. It's a beautiful person who's beautiful and good. Goodness and beauty go together in a way.
Okay.
So all this shows that it's very difficult to come up with a list of virtues for everyone in the modern mondialized world of mondialization or globalization. And UNESCO has a project which is called the Virtue Project. You can Google it and you'll find 49, they have listed 49 virtues from different cultures, and they try to find a core for all of us, for all cultures, the common core, and then you cultivate. Try to cultivate them. Will it work? Is it practical? I don't know.
So here you quote Rosalind
Rosalind
Herthaus. Yes, and the quote is, "Virtues are not merely tendencies to act; they are excellence of character." So that made me kind of think of something. It's kind of like a chicken or the egg kind of dilemma of like what came first, your character or your actions. Like, do your actions reflect your character, or does your character reflect your actions? So how would you form?
That is one of the problems, in fact, because when some virtue ethicist tells you, look at your character, how will you evaluate the character if you don't know in advance what are the principles that will help you understand which are the real valuable traits? First of all, there are two problems. One problem is how will you know how to build them first? Who will teach you? You must already have them, and that's why you need a man of practical wisdom who will guide you, so to speak. Okay. And then the other thing is how you apply them. Rosalind Herthaus has come up with what she calls V rules, virtue rules. If you read her book, she derives rules that she derives them from the virtuous people. But you have to have virtuous people to begin with. And the question is, how do you begin developing them? Where do you get the model from?
And also I feel like that also plays into the elitist model.
The problem of that is called aristocratic, but you use the word correct, the word elitist. It's like a kind of intellectual elite, which is not just intellectual, it's political.
Right.
And today, again, coming back to my original point, we live in a kind of liberal framework in which we don't like to be told, the elite will know. They have the perfection of a very...
The virtuous person will be the judge of
what is virtuous.
Which is virtuous, and if someone who is not necessarily dubbed virtuous is doing a virtuous act or something along those lines. So where does that third party have to come in? Or does there have to be that third party as the judge of said virtues and actions?
And embodied knowledge. It's knowledge of somebody who lives. He's not just a theoretician. He's the man of practical wisdom is both the judge and the actor, the agent. So he observes also other people. Suppose he's a kind of teacher of morality. He's a model himself. And there are young people who approach him and want to study. He shows them by his example what to do. And actually Aristotle warns us that young people cannot develop, they haven't yet developed virtue because they don't also have the eye of experience that the man of practical wisdom has developed through experience. And so this man is like the rule himself. He embodies the rule. In fact, if you look at the definition of virtue of character, of moral virtue, Aristotle says that virtues or excellence is a disposition which is developed through habituation. It teaches us to discern a mean between two extremes, a mean for us, which is not the same for everybody, because you may need more, I may need less, which is defined by a rational principle and by the man of practical wisdom himself. In other words, it's not just theory, he sees it.
Yeah.
Now, some people say, what is this? It's like a guru who can show to you. I cannot tell you what it is, I'll show it to you. So this is what I call existential model. And so the third, it may look like a third party, but really it's not just a detached third party. But as I said before, there is a problem of, as you said it, a problem of exact practicality. I mean, you need the rules. You need to teach people rules of thumb and rules that they may work on later. Yeah. But nothing can replace experience, moral experience, and immersion in practice. Like when I said about doctors or business people, the virtuous businessman is someone who has acquired experience and has combined theoretical knowledge with this kind of skills. Again, where do you take your models from? Because you may move in a circle. You may move and say, what, like you said before, but I mean, who are they, and who will teach whom? How are we going to select and train the teachers who will teach us? I mean, in ancient times, at the time of Aristotle, the standards were these excellent people in the city of Athens. Some of them were virtuous politicians for Aristotle. I think he uses Pericles at some point, Pericles and Themistocles. And he doesn't mention Plato. I mean, the theoretical wisdom is the highest ideal for Aristotle too, but he leaves that outside the public life. In other words, not outside, on the margins, and moral and political philosopher, Ronald Dworkin, whom I mentioned before in our conversation. Now, Dworkin tries to combine liberalism at one level, which means equality, fairness, things that he gets from John Rawls, with a perfectionist element. In other words, he believes, on the one hand, that everybody, should be treated fairly, and you don't bring into this at some level for principles of justice, allocation of resources, distribution, to use the word distribution. You don't bring in meritocratic or virtue considerations. You bring in egalitarian. He's a kind of egalitarian liberal, and at the same time he also believes that he draws a distinction between the moral and the ethical. The moral is what involves what we owe to the other, what we owe to each other, as Tim Scanlon used to say, one of my teachers. And at the same time, he speaks of ethical considerations regarding how I should live, how I ought to live for myself. In other words, other regarding considerations come under what he calls moral. That's a special use he makes of the word. And ethical involves how ought I to live. The two for him are connected. In other words, you cannot be a mafia person and be happy. Aristotle would say, you daimon. You are not really flourishing. You think you are happy in a superficial kind of subjectivist way. Now, Dworkin believes that at the level of the moral, the level of interaction with other people, where we abide by deontological moral rules, what is primary are these principles, distributions. When you look at yourself and you think, what makes me a flourishing person, there he brings in perfection. He brings in what he calls excellent performance. You are like a performer, and he uses metaphors like a dancer or an athlete. and he doesn't use virtue, the word virtue so much. And in a paper which I have written, I may send you that, and I say, well, Dworkin needs a virtue theory there. I mean, actually, he's talking about the virtues without using the word. He's talking like a perfectionist. Some people think that's too aristocratic. In other words, but he has it both ways. At the level of social interaction and at the level of public life, liberal equality is primary. Right. At the level of your private flourishing, if you like, he doesn't use the word flourishing, but he used the word of achievement, good performance, excellent performance. Yeah. You need to cultivate your skills, and you need to have also aesthetic, giving your life, giving meaning to your life. Okay. And that is a kind of task. It's a task like the virtue tasks.
Also, in your paper, you talk about like the epistemology of virtues, right? And even like you mentioned, like the mafia example of them perceiving themselves as being happy or whatnot, but they're not like actually flourishing, right? So, I guess, how do you know when you've gotten to a certain virtue, and then also where does like empiricism, because like obviously that shows that empiricism is not the epistemological theory here to apply correctly, but like where does like perceptions really come in?
That's a very difficult philosophical question, because there is an empiricist dimension. In other words, this is related to some kind of perception which involves feelings and involves the correct training of feelings. But although we generally say that Aristotle was an empiricist, there is also a rationalist element there. There is some kind of thought process which guides you about human function, the ergon, what I call the work of a human being, and that doesn't come from the senses. It comes from philosophical speculation and theory. Now, to use an example that has been used for the epistemology and ontology of virtue, this is one of the big differences between Aristotle's moral epistemology and Plato's moral epistemology. And this is why Martha Nussbaum, in her Fragility of Goodness, has criticized Plato, because in Plato you have this crazy idea that if you are a philosopher who knows mathematics and moves at the sphere of abstraction and perceives the good, I mean his mind, intellectual perception, that's there it is rationalist. I mean there you are up there in the skies, and then you become a philosopher king, and you know how you're going to do it. Disaster. I mean, Aristotle warns us. He says it's lack of training to think that you can apply the principles of mathematics to the realm of contingency and of practicality, where there is ambiguity and so on. While in Plato, you have the feeling that if you are a good mathematician, you're also going to be a good politician. And we know that this is not true. I think Nussbaum is unfair to Plato, because in Plato there are also some wonderful passages, especially in myths, where he has a sense of guilt. He describes moral feelings, guilt, or aspiration, anxiety before choice. These things you don't find in Aristotle. In Aristotle, it's more plain. But in Aristotle, you have a more correct moral epistemology, which is empiricist plus some rational elements, but not rationalist all through, like in Plato. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you.
In Aristotle, there is this idea of a master craftsman. So the phronimos, the man of practical wisdom, has, and epistemologically speaking, has an intellectual skill which is peculiar for practical matters. So there is an epistemology of the practical and an epistemology of the theoretical. Let's say there are builders, and then there is a craftsman. Imagine a building, you want to build a building. Now, the virtuous person is also like the master craftsman who knows from experience and from his skills that he has developed where to put the stones and how to build the building. Right. He is no theorist of the kind of a civil engineer or architect who is the philosopher who knows why this is so. He has a grasp of Aristotle would say the Phronimus, the man of practical wisdom, has a grasp of the why, but it's a practical, empirical grasp of the why. He doesn't have to give an account of the chemical composition of the stone this is for the philosopher who does theoretical work. We would say for the advanced scientist.
Maybe practical has a different definition here, but normally when we use the word practical, we mean something that can be applied in everyday life. So if the virtues are so unrealistic, if it's unrealistic to actually attain such virtues, the practicality of it seems not very practical.
You are right. But for instance, to give you an example, there is a whole branch, a whole field of normative ethics, which is called applied ethics. Right. And in applied ethics, you deal with bioethics, with medical ethics, also business ethics, or environmental ethics, war ethics. And there, you are looking for specific answers. You are looking for guidelines. But if you go to virtue ethics, they will tell you, well, ask the man of practical wisdom to help you develop virtues like he has. But isn't this, like what you said, it's not very practical. And if you want applied ethics, you want some applications now, you work for a hospital. Suppose you're an ethicist working for a hospital, advising people about euthanasia and so on. Right. I mean, don't you need some rules like the deontological or consequentialist rules so that you advise the family and so on? Can you wait for the virtues to develop in a patient or in a doctor or in the medical personnel? The quick answer would be, well, you cannot do it, drop it. The long answer, which I would like to have a more balanced approach, would be that, look, try to have both. In other words, and that's why I would argue for a kind of mixed model, not a pure virtue ethics model, but a mixed deontological and perhaps with some consequentialist elements and virtues model, in the sense that I do want doctors, and that's what medical humanities is for. I want doctors to be trained through examples and develop this kind of practical wisdom through working next to an experienced doctor with lots of experience and with the proper feelings, because virtue is also about regulating our feelings and knowing how to do that. And that takes a long time. But in the meantime, don't neglect the principles. Don't think that your virtue, your ethics is going to be an ethics only of virtues and not of principles. Try to combine both. I want to have both, some principles and virtues, which is very difficult to get, but I want both. Right. Some people say it's not coherent, but you have to strive for it. You have to make a synthesis.
Yeah. How might that synthesis play out in reality?
Now, today, what would people? I mean, Dworkin at the end of his book, there's this wonderful book, which is Justice for Hedgehogs. And some people say, what are these hedgehogs? I mean, are they real hedgehogs? No, this comes from an ancient poet, Greek poet, who said there are two, there are hedgehogs and foxes, and foxes know many things, but hedgehogs know one big thing. So what Dworkin wants to teach us, and this was taken up by Isaiah Berlin, a historian of ideas in the 40s, I think, in a paper, The Hedgehog and the Fox, it's called. So what Dworkin wants to tell us is that he is a hedgehog because he has one big idea. The big idea is that the realm of value is united. Values, moral values, ethical values, aesthetic values are somehow united. The good life is a life which also involves morality. They are united. due to this globalization, and everything becomes a commodity. And that's where commercialization of everything and so on. We tend to miss some aspects of life that are very, and the virtuous person wouldn't be like that. The virtuous person would want this balance. Okay.
So the balance.
Yes, balance. I think that's what we need, but we cannot get. And we cannot get also for practical reasons. I mean, I mentioned globalization, but there are also things like the speed. You have to go fast today. You don't enjoy things in the proper way. By the way, what Aristotle says about the virtuous person of moral practical wisdom is that he knows how you feel pleasures and pain, how you feel it in the proper way, to the proper extent, at the proper moment, to the proper person. I mean, you know exactly the right way and the right amount, and this is not taught by abstract principle, it's taught through life. And another model which we didn't discuss today, but which you should look at, which complements Aristotle, is the Stoic model. If you look at Stoic philosophers, they also have a theory of virtue which is more rationalist. It's not so empiricist. I mean, it doesn't have this and there they have this faith in reason.
Thank you very much for speaking with me today. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments below what you think of virtue ethics and what virtues do you prioritize. Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.